Welcome, Dr. Jason Dean, Brave TV, your source for health, freedom, and knowledge. Before we jump in, crazy day, lots of stuff going on, but also we are streaming live over on Rumble. So rumble.com/c/Dr. Jason Dean. You've seen that the way I'll bring it up more when Fred is on here. Also, this morning went live at 7:30 in the morning for about a half hour called the Morning Brew. It is a test. It's a pilot. See how it goes. If it works, if I like it, trying something a little different. But we are streaming live on Rumble. We're also over here streaming live on X as always, so you can check that out. And then and you just scroll down, you'll see the live. You can tell the live is on because there's a little red around the avatar there. And then, of course, for as long as they allow us to, because you never know what we're going to get ourselves in trouble with. We're also live over here on Facebook, which is not a Facebook page. It's not a business page, it's just my page. So you'll see Jason Dean, just my name. And then you'll know because you'll see the blue verification badge that I now end up having to pay for. That's fine. It is what it is. But yeah, so go there, check us out, and lots of fun stuff coming. But now, after long awaited time, and you know what? I'm glad we're having him on today because there's so much different to talk about today than there was even just the last time he was here. So, Fred Dashevsky, my good buddy. How are you, sir?
I am doing great. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Good to see you. How have you been?
We've been terrific.
Fantastic. So I did a little test. I tried. I've been telling the viewers for a long time about how I stumbled onto you. And it was because I was listening to Patrick from OneRadioNetwork.com when he was still living.
We miss Patrick.
And I was originally, I think I stumbled onto I don't know how I stumbled onto Patrick, but I stumbled onto Andy with Patrick, right? And so what I did was I actually reached out to the people at OneRadioNetwork.com and I didn't hear anything from them. I'm still going to try to reach out because there's the stuff is still sitting out there. It's such valuable information. But what I did was I went over to SoundCloud and I found out how much content of just the real world of money was out there. And so I took some of that. I took an episode 2 hours long with Patrick and Andy from like 2013 or something like that.
Wow.
And I streamed it on this channel last week. And I started listening to the first 20 minutes of it myself. Fred, you could literally run that exact episode today as if it was totally present time and nothing would be different.
Well, the first thing that occurs to me is I want to quote Randy Bachman, Bachman Turner Overdrive. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Oh, yeah. So I remember when last time I had you on, which has been more often. I just have to remember to schedule it. I kept asking you for the last couple of years, how would we get to a gold standard? And you're like, I just don't know if I see the mechanism for that, whatever. Where are you at today with all this? Because ever since, we've had how much gold's in Fort Knox.
Right.
He says the best is yet to come. He says we're going to be wealthier than ever. You're getting rid of taxes off of things. Totally different world, isn't it?
It is. So, the Fort Knox thing is interesting. When Steve Mnuchin was Secretary Treasury, he actually did already visit Fort Knox. So that was, it wasn't that long ago, about 5 years ago or so. And they found what they expected. The strategic holding of the United States is there and the stockpile of gold is there. I don't know that most people recognize, though, that most of the gold held by the United States is actually held at the Federal Reserve Bank building in New York at the sub-treasuries. That's where all the trading goes on. So when one country buys gold from another, they move these the gold bars around within the big vaults down there. And the strategic stockpile that's held at Kentucky and Fort Knox has really been there since the 70s. But most of the gold reserve that we use for conducting of commerce doesn't exist there, but there is a gold supply there. And I think it's kind of cute that they want to stick their head in the door and like, it's like habeas corpus, show me the body. So this is like produce the gold. I want to see it. I want to touch it. I want to know that it actually exists. I don't really think we're going to catch too many surprises. But on the subject of a gold standard, I don't know if you caught this. The state of Wyoming did something really incredible just this month. They actually passed a law. It's SF 96, and it requires that the stockpile of capital held within the strategic fund of the state of Wyoming be diversified to include physical gold and silver. They're actually requiring that the state within its sovereign wealth fund hold a quantity of gold and silver. And provision number 2, if you pull up this bill, SF 96, calls for investigating how the public could actually use gold and silver to conduct commerce. A fascinating forward movement in the concept. I'm sorry, you're asking me to hold?
No, you're good. You keep going. I'm just trying to get my buttons right over here. You keep talking. There you go. There's the Wyoming Gold Act.
Yeah, it's incredible. So if you read section 2, it's really interesting. So they want to actually create an established process by which the public can pay with gold and silver. And I think this is a incredible opportunity that every state should take advantage of and start pushing for that requirement that their states hold some gold and silver within their accounts, because most states hold large amounts of money in various pension accounts. A lot of those funds are held by the banks in New York, and that's just the nature of how they do that. And these are sometimes funds that are held, that the public may use in the future, tax revenues before they're distributed. But normally they're held by the Goldman Sachs and those types of investment banking firms and held in the banks in New York. But again, strategically, Wyoming decided, and they refer to them as the cowboy state. They're a little more unusual, but as a state, it's a really interesting process that they've come up with. When I first heard about this, the concern was that the governor wasn't going to sign it, but they went ahead and did it. And, the previous governor, who had been apparently a very left-leaning person, had pushed back against it and used the same kind of arguments that 100 years ago had been used when the conversations came up of gold being a barbarous relic. The old conversations that came up from Maynard Keynes, the famous economists from 100 years ago, who had made the argument then that there was no purpose for gold. Of course, we can look back in history and realize how ridiculous a conversation that was then.
Even the crypto people say that today. And I'm a crypto person. But there's this group of crypto people out there, especially the Bitcoin junkies. They call them Bitcoin maxis.
Okay.
Fred, they're like, gold is outdated. It's archaic. It's not worth anything anymore because we can't do anything with it. So Bitcoin is going to become the no gold. And I'm thinking to myself, are you guys insane? Just the utility aspects of gold itself and the way the metal can be used. I mean, obviously, we're not going to transfer it all over all the place all the time, but to say it's an archaic thing is completely that's lunacy.
It is. Well, I see these two things, crypto and gold, very different in the way that they are functioning as economic tools, if you will. And I've always looked at the idea that, gold has what we call an intrinsic value. So in the end, whatever supplies of gold exist, there is a physical item there. And, when you know about the crypto, you recognize, of course, there is nothing physical. I mean, I can hold up a $20 gold coin and say, here is a physical, actual gold coin. And,
sure.
Here it is in the real world. I can touch it. I can hold it. I can feel it. And the people that purchase it get physical possession and they own something tangible. So, with the crypto, what we have to maintain in order for its value to stay or grow is a group of like-minded people that believe it has value because of the limitations and how many of them can be created and the functionality of it. But so far to date, the functionality part of it has still been pretty rough. I mean, I doubt you've ever spent any of your crypto to actually buy anything. Nobody really does that.
I have bought stuff before with it.
Have you really? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I mean, small amounts of stuff. I haven't done big stuff. I just wanted to see if it obviously worked, and it was trying out. A lot of people take payments in it. But it's more of code. I look at crypto as software, right?
Sure.
So like crypto will be part of the new payment system. Like it's in the Fed Now services, things like that. But at the end of the day, heavy metal, or I should say precious metals. I mean, there's a reason central banks are buying it up like crazy right now.
All of them. In fact, they're setting records. When we started looking at it in November, we saw record pricing purchases by central banks all over the world. That went again in November, December, January. It has continued. Did you see the price of gold today? I mean, we're at $2,975 an ounce for gold. I mean, it is really moving up. Of course, now this is in response to what are now becoming trade wars, which is something I don't think a lot of people expected. I know there was a lot of talk about the idea of using tariffs as a method of trying to alter the economy and hopefully in the end benefiting Americans. But, you know, the way that we've attacked this has been so unusual. Somebody made the funniest analogy I've heard, which is like what we're doing in the economy every day now is like putting on a blindfold and trying to play whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
You know, we just don't know what's coming up next. And the markets are so unsettled. There is a index in the stock market. They call it the VIX, the volatility index. And I don't know if you've ever paid attention to it, but in normal times, you know, if that number on the VIX was 8 or 9, you know, that's a little bit above average. We saw 27, 28 yesterday. It's back a little bit today in the low 20s. But the higher that number, the more that the volatility is anticipated on a day-to-day basis in the market. So in other words, they're not expecting the stock market to move or up or down 100, but maybe 1,000 points a day. Like we saw Monday, 1,000 point drop in the Dow, right? So the volatility is through the roof right now. We are getting people just literally like walking in the door and calling up and saying, you know, I think it's time I need to own a little bit of gold and silver. For anybody who's never done it before, really need to get on board this train. I mean, the US dollar is facing the biggest issues it's ever faced since the end of World War II. We're really beginning to lose grip on the world's status of the US dollar as world's reserve currency. And the pushback has been huge. Now, on top of that, you throw in, you know, upsetting our trading partners. I mean, people are feeling badly about Canada. You know, poor Canada. Like they woke up one day and they're like, well, what did we do? I mean, how did we aggravate you so much that suddenly we're getting tariffs? So, you know, look at aluminum.
I was just in Canada. I was just in Canada, and a lot of them want to be the 51st state. A lot of people are going, we'll be the 51st. They're so upset.
That's interesting.
They're so upset about their politics. I mean, I was told by friends in Canada when I was there at dinner that there are people in Canada who have 2 family members working, husband and wife with kids, and not just working, like lawyers, doctors, like legitimate skill sets, right? And Fred, with both of them working that way, they were still having to visit the food pantry to eat.
Wow.
Which is completely insane.
It is insane. I mean, that was the U.S. issue too. So, you know, they used to talk about the 1950s and 60s. One person working an average job was able to make enough money up to the 1960s to pay all the taxes that were due, feed a family of 4, take a yearly vacation maybe once or twice a year, and own a home outright, or be able to pay a mortgage
and be comfortably happy.
And yeah, I mean, they weren't wealthy, but they were stable. And again, you know, if you think about the basic lifestyle, you know, if you comfortably could say, I could afford my mortgage, I could take care of my family's needs, I could actually save a buck or two, vacation once in a while, it wasn't a bad lifestyle. Right now, it's actually at a point where you need about 2.5 people's income to cover the same expenses. So almost one person's income in a married family where both are really well employed, one person's income is just going to taxes. And then you have the last income, the second income, that's got to cover 100%. Everything else. And it's becoming progressively more difficult for people to do that. I'm getting a lot of pushback from retired people or people about to retire who are so disappointed that their retirement accounts are paying the amounts they expected, but they never anticipated this loss in value in money, and they didn't account for it. And I think this is the whole basis for the rationale of having that antiquated gold and silver, if you will. And I say that in air quotes,
Sure.
obviously.
No, it's true.
Right. So at least it gives people a counterbalance because, the rate at which we're printing money, everybody seems to almost be ignoring this again because of all the other distractions that are coming up on a day-to-day basis, which is almost, it's almost entertaining. But it is really difficult for people to not recognize the results. And look at what happened when we saw the inflation rate kick up last year. I mean, the pushback from the public was enormous. People are freaking out about the cost of eggs and the cost of goods and services. And now we're going to take, for example, okay, so we're going to institute a trade problem with Canada that sells us about 50% of the aluminum that we buy. So how is this not going to translate into higher costs in America if we keep pushing against all of our trading partners and having to see prices go up because we're now instituting all of these new tariffs on all these various countries? And I get it that we've had an imbalance in trade. I mean, America is a big consumer, right? We buy everybody's stuff.
We are the
love to
consumer
buy-
nation. We buy
we love
everybody.
to buy and we love to buy the cheap crap that comes from every country, right? But, you can use trade and you can use tariffs to try to protect an industry. Like look at the steel industry in America. Okay. So you want to
Sure.
protect them. You have to stop those cheap Chinese steel imports. So you put a tariff on it. I get that. But the idea that this is not going to create a higher price eventually for Americans, I find that a little hard to swallow. So I think we're all going to pay for this in the end. But this volatility and uncertainty that we're experiencing now is something that nobody knows what to make of. I mean, the professional traders, the guys that are day traders, they're just going nuts. I mean, they got to stay up all night just to try to keep up with what might happen tomorrow when the bell rings and the new market's open.
Now, something I pick up on, which is which I'm going to bring up here. Technology is being really slow today, which is quite strange. So I have this when it comes up frozen now, which
chart.
is great.
Yeah.
Give it a second. Let's see here. Yeah, I'm gonna make sure it pops up. So we have the silver and gold. There we go. Okay, it wasn't showing on my side. We have silver at 33.81 an ounce, gold a little under 3,000. But over here, I am curious about something. And I may be completely wrong, which is fine. But right now, the Dow is like 40,000, almost 41,000, right? Obviously, it's been down a little bit. But if I go back to the 5-year mark, so 5 years ago, and I'm curious what we do about this, right? We've increased 20,000 in the Dow roughly since 2020, Fred. But the problem is, the last 5 years has been a money printing bonanza, right? Do we see anything? Is there a lot of cushion in this for a giant crash?
Oh, there sure is, because what perpetrated a lot of the growth was artificially low interest rates that allowed companies to borrow money for zero or next to zero and use that capital to purchase back their own stock, driving the values higher and higher, not because of additional interest from the general public, demand from the public, or a sense that there were more profits in these companies, but instead it was following the trend of the upward growth, which was perpetrated again by cheap money. Now, as soon as interest rates started going up, we saw a slowdown in the rate at which companies were using that opportunity to buy their own stock back. And again, so a lot of this has to do with the relative strength of the economy, how inexpensive interest rates are, and whether or not they can maintain this process of continually accumulating stock to drive up its value. What we really want to see is growth in the stock market because of real economic activity. And here's where we're starting to run into a problem. Trade wars are beginning to translate to a possible slowdown in a lot of different areas across the board in the economy. If costs are going up and prices are going up, the expectation is a lot of the companies may not sell as much. And if the
Right.
profits go down and the sales go down, so do the stocks. They're going to follow that trend. And right now, that's being translated into the possibility, which is growing every day, that we might set the entire economy into a recession, which is a very, very weak economic environment that goes on for several months. 3 quarters in a row of downward movement is a recessionary economy. And that would require the Fed to start lowering interest rates again to try to jumpstart the economy. And we're playing this very volatile game. So the possibility of recession is growing, and the values we see in the stock market right now, which have been a little overinflated for quite some time on all this cheap money, could be coming to an end. And then what happens is you have to really find out where's the real value. What's real there in each of these companies, and where should that stock price be? And if people translate the idea that they don't believe the current value was legitimate, that it was manipulated, well, then there could be a tremendous amount of change in those values. It could be 20%, 30%. There's a lot of room for the stock market to go down dramatically. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, they have like 401ks and things of their retirement nature tied to the stock market. And if the market continues to drop and doesn't recover, a lot of people who've waited for many, many years are going to find themselves at the end of the retirement line where values have dropped precipitously. And I'm really worried about that. And I really believe people need to consider seriously, if they haven't already, to start diversifying at least some of their capital to make sure that they can counterbalance what can become a big problem. There are a lot of real smart people lining up thinking there's going to be a real big market crash. Now, that's different than
That was Chad
just
GPT, and all I asked was about tariffs, a trade war, Federal Reserve, and recession, and it gave out basically exactly what you just said.
That's interesting. Yeah, I wonder how the AI is handling that. Of course, the AI is only as good as the people who programmed it,
Yeah,
right?
of course it is, and that's based
Right.
off of obviously articles. But the fact that what you're talking about does come up, you're not the only one talking about it.
And again, I was, I guess, following a trend here, but I've been looking at this for a really long time. And what really has shocked me is the rate at which the volatility has started to become an issue. So when that VIX hit 29, earlier this week, I mean, we haven't seen anything like that in a long time. The worst I ever saw was the week that Lehman crashed in 2008. It jumped to 60 something that day. But I mean, it's never been anywhere near that since. It's running around 8, 10, 12. That's fairly normal. So with a high VIX, that means we have to expect volatility. So, if you're close to retirement, the last thing you want to see is 1,000-point swings in the market. What you want is a kind of calm market, goes up and down a little bit every day,
Right.
no problem. But 1,000-point swings, my goodness, and not knowing what to anticipate because again, we're in an environment where the rules have been changed. And, like I said, it's a blindfolded whack-a-mole game, really hard to figure out what's going to pop up next. And I don't know how to plan for that except to try to stabilize that environment with something physical and tangible. And I just can't get over the rate at which people are just piling into gold and silver all over the world, from the central banks down to the individual investors, and watching the price creep up and creep up and creep up. I mean, even this year, we started at about 2,600, 26 and a quarter January 1st, and now we're 29.75. So what is that, 12%? So, this is all in anticipation of what we don't know coming. And the more that President Trump plays this game of upsetting the apple cart and just pretty much making up stuff as he goes along and, see what works. And if it doesn't, you backpedal it. And if it works, okay, move forward. I think it's a really interesting time. There's that old Chinese expression, may you live in interesting times. Well, the other thing that occurs to me is be careful what you wish for.
100%. So I have questions for you that I am trying to understand and research on my own, but it's not my industry. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to ask Fred, because I want to break this down super simple, because it doesn't fully make sense to me. We've talked about this in the past, but a lot of people are talking about like bonds and treasuries. Bonds and treasuries are the same thing, essentially, correct?
Essentially, yes.
Okay. But when we talk about those, that essentially means America wants something to be built, or they have a project or infrastructure, whatever it is, and they put out and they say, hey, anybody want to buy into this, invest into us, you get a percentage back, and then you get your money back plus whatever at the end. Generally, it's kind of an interest loan type situation. Now, at
Well,
face
those would be like
value,
municipal bonds. Yes.
okay, is that what generally bonds are, municipal bonds, or they're different
Mhm.
categories?
Well, there are different categories. So what you're talking about is the way bonds should be used. Okay. I
Okay,
want to build a bridge. It's going to cost $10 million. I'm going to float $10 million worth of new debt. I'm going to borrow that money from people willing to give it to me today. And as you mentioned, I'm going to pay them a little interest on their money. Then I get the usage of that capital. I get to build the bridge. The bridge is completed. And maybe we put a toll on the bridge to collect
sure.
back some of the revenue, and this allows us to pay back the interest and the borrowed money. Now, separate from that, there are United States government issued bonds, debt instruments from the US Treasury, which do not go specifically to any one project, but finance the United States government in all of its operations. So it allows the government to use the money for whatever it decides it wants to. And we have a need in America to sell a tremendous amount of bond debt every single week because the government is spending so much money. The 36 trillion in debt, interest payments alone are well over $1 trillion a year now. In order to make that money, we have to sell bonds.
That leads
And
to my question. Why would anyone want to buy a bond of ours when I mean, other than the fact that the dollar is still the king of the world technically, why would countries, and this is just me trying to understand this from a
no, it's a great
common sense
question.
standpoint. Why would anyone want it when we're so out of control?
Well, it's a great question, and it is an interesting question. And the problem is, the more people who start to ask that question, the less they're going to be willing to buy those
I mean,
bonds. Now,
like if the family next door is bankrupt and they're running credit cards up and they're like, "Hey, we're going to build something in our yard. You want to invest in it?" I'm like, "No, I don't want to invest in it." I mean, I know that's not really an example, but it kind of is.
yeah, a comparable example would be somebody who has borrowed money from you and they can't repay it, so they want to borrow more, and
Right.
they keep doing that from everybody until they can't find anybody else to loan them any money. So the rationale for the people that buy the bond are two things. Bonds are considered AAA rated. In other words, they are about as stable as any kind of debt instrument can be. So, of all the various types of debt instruments that are out there, the US Treasury bonds are considered the top of the tier. And that's true around the world. Because, as crazy as it would be on the surface to just take an intelligent, objective look and say, wait a minute, you guys are 36 trillion in debt. Why the hell would I even think about giving you
That's all I
money that
think
you're
about it when I look at finance. I'm like, what? Like,
makes
why
no
would
sense?
they buy us?
But by default, it's the best option available amongst all of the other countries out there and their debt instruments. The US is the
Okay.
most stable. So what you're doing is you're basically placing a bet that the government will hold up its end of the obligation. Now, you and I probably both know the reality of how they're going to do that is they're going to print the money. That's how they're going to make good on those obligations. But the running problem is we have created so much debt that the need for us to sell bonds has grown. Look at bond sales every week and the numbers, how the
So
volume
we
has
have to sell
blown up.
more the more money we print.
Yeah, we
Okay.
have to create more bonds because we need more capital coming in. Now, we cannot sell enough of these bonds to the people in America. Americans will not buy enough of this stuff domestically to fill the
Okay.
needs. So what happens is we start relying on foreign countries and we say to the foreign investors, please buy our debt. And again, why do they do that? Because the US dollar still reigns supreme around the world.
Do they kind
Now,
of get
what
some do they
happens?
get some ownership and leverage over us when they do that as well, as in like they kind of have like America by the cojones?
To a point. I mean, people used to make that argument about China, but when you looked at the total amount of bonds that they held at the peak, it was about $2 trillion.
Okay.
It really barely made a dent in the overall volume. And they actually sold more than half of what they have, or close to that. It was about 800 billion worth over the last year or two. They have been divesting themselves of U.S.
Okay.
dollar, and they're looking for alternatives. So here's what I'm worried about. If the dollar status is shaky, and if things like BRICS come up and become a more powerful opportunity, or at least an option, many of the people that are currently helping us by buying our bonds may choose not to. And that will be the death of the US dollar. It will absolutely crush us as a country, because then the only thing left for us to do is print. And if we have to print the amount of money that we currently now sell in debt instruments, if you think you've seen inflation before, hold on to your proverbial hat, because it will absolutely rip through the economy like a thunderstorm. It's going to be horrific. And we are teeter-tottering on absolute disaster of the US dollar, because we're using the dollar as a weapon. And that's a dangerous game to play.
Absolutely.
So, for example, we've used it against Putin. We've locked him out of the SWIFT banking system. We've forbidden a lot of the transactions that occur. But you keep doing that, and again, using trade war issues, we may aggravate others outside the U.S. who would normally say, I don't mind buying your bond debt and that. But if we continue to, poke the bear, there could come a time where this demand for U.S. dollar debt-based instruments falls. And if it drops to a point where we cannot sell enough of it, the only thing we have left as an option, well, we'd have to crank interest rates. We'd have to raise taxes through the roof. It's not going to happen. So we're going to print a lot of paper money in order to create enough to fill the gap. So the question you ask about why would anybody rationally want to buy a U.S. Treasury is a very dangerous question.
So I'm not crazy then. It's not illogical for me to be thinking that.
No, it's not. It makes perfect sense. And this is the problem as I see it, is that gap between what makes common sense and what's happening in the world, they're getting farther apart. Okay. I mean, they used to be somewhat related, and you could sort of explain away a lot of this stuff. It's getting really hard to do that. And every once in a while, somebody comes up and says, well, not only are we looking at a debt problem, but what about the obligations the government currently has? Like, okay, let's take the big one, Social Security. What most people don't know is the Social Security fund was raided back when Bill Clinton was president. Robert Rubin, when he was Treasury Secretary, took all of the money out of Social Security and put it into the government's existing budget. He replaced it with government bonds, these debt instruments that you and I are talking about. But that wasn't good enough. 6 months later, he actually cashed all those bonds out, found a secondary buyer, and replaced the bonds with IOUs written by the Secretary Treasury.
That seems a little criminal.
Thing left.
That seems criminal, and it sounds like dangerous.
Well, I look at it as criminal because this is a trust fund. In other words, this is not the government's money to spend. This is your money. They didn't ask you whether you wanted that to be taken out of your paycheck every week. You never had a choice. They stripped that fund right out of your check every week. And that money was supposed to be segregated. The legal definition of a trust are funds set aside for a specific purpose, not to be utilized for anything else. Well, we've violated the trust. So now, as the baby boomers are retiring and more Americans are getting older and demand from Social Security is growing, we're finding we don't have the money. And what's happening is the government is literally printing as it needs to send out checks, which leads us to this week. The government, again, has run out of money.
Yes.
So we've exceeded the debt limit, and we're about 24 hours from another government shutdown if Congress does not agree to raise the debt limit. And again, the debt limit is money already spent. This is not future spending we're talking about. We're talking about obligations that we already have. In other words, we've written the check's about to hit the bank, and we got to make sure that the funds are there. So we are fighting this battle quickly to try to make sure we can cover the debt. And we've hit the limit at which Congress said, And I don't know why they play this mental game, but they do. They say we don't want to exceed this number. And if we get to this number, well, we're going to start instituting emergency, processes. We're going to slow down government spending or cut government services or stop sending out Social Security checks to people. Of course, there would be an outcry and a revolution on the streets. People would be lining up at the front doors of Washington in no time. So, the Democrats are finding themselves in a pretty awkward position. We have seen a Republican-controlled president, a Republican-controlled Senate, and a Republican-controlled House. So the Democrats have almost zero leverage. And I don't think they know what to make of what's happening with what Trump
They can't
is
do
doing.
anything. I mean, at the end of the day, if Trump says he wants this, it's going to get passed, right?
Right. So the Democrats are almost, they have no power. They have no leverage. And what they're going to try to do is utilize the possibility of a government shutdown to give them some leverage to try to get whatever policies they want to see or things they don't want to see reversed.
So they flip-flop. They didn't want government shutdowns before because it was print, print, print.
Right.
Now they're like, hey, let's do a government shutdown because it's just the stupid same old back and forth.
Exactly. And what they're going to try to do is use it as a leverage point. So it's a hostage situation. So they say to the United States as a country, we're going to hold you hostage unless we get what we want. Like little crybabies, they're going to say, if you don't give me what I want, well, I'm going to have a temper tantrum. And my temper tantrum is I'm not going to vote to extend the new higher limit for government spending. If they don't pass it, we get a shutdown. And we've had a few of those in the past, and they're ugly. And within a matter of a week or so, what you get is, horrific problems starting to show up for things that are supposed to be paid for by the government on a regular basis. But again, this is money already spent. We have to agree to raise the debt limit. It's almost foolish not to. But if we use it politically as a weapon, we create, again, uncertainty and volatility. And the more that the Democrats try to use this as a tool, the more uncertainty and volatility you're going to see in the open markets. And I think you're going to see response in gold and silver prices as well, because people are going to rush to a safe haven environment when they don't know what to do.
So President Trump, not that I'm like worshiping everything he says, but he's up to something. I can tell he's up to something. He is a gold bug himself. He keeps saying, we're going to be winning so much. You can't imagine how much we're going to be winning. You get tired of winning. The best is yet to come, etc. If we were to go back to somehow, some way, shape, or form, a gold standard monetary reset in the next 18 months, let's call it, right? I don't know how it works. I'm not telling you I do. Can we save this whole thing technically? And under a gold standard, do you not have to worry anymore about bond problem, spending problem? I mean, obviously I'm talking about a utopia, but would that be the case?
Well, here's what would happen. What you would get is a stable dollar. So it would not be losing value anymore to inflation since you couldn't print any more money than you actually had gold backing it. That would stabilize the value of the dollar from the ability to just simply print anytime you ran out of money. That would solve that problem. The problem it would create, though, is you would lock the government out of the possibility of doing what it's going to do tomorrow, which is raise the debt limits. So it would create a real short-term shock to the economy because you're going to stabilize the value of the dollar and also simultaneously cut off this nonsense of the government just simply being able to print its way out of every problem. Similarly, like if you were borrowing money and suddenly somebody said, okay, that's it, you have to start making real payments back on those debts, or you can't borrow another dollar, you're done unless you find a way to raise that capital. So a gold backed or a gold standard would do tremendous good on the long term for the overall state of everyone's wealth.
But still massive turbulation, correct?
On the short term, I'd love to see how Congress would have to deal with the idea that we're locking them down to suddenly saying, sorry, you can't play these ridiculous economic games you've been playing for decades. We're going to lock you out of that by forcing you to maintain standards against the money that you create.
What would
And
they even do? What do they? What are they're so used to this game.
I don't know how they would manage it. And that's been my fundamental thought about this since day one is I want a gold standard more than most people can
Right.
understand. I mean,
Well, you
I've been
told me
fighting for it
you
for
want it,
40
you just don't
years.
know the mechanism, right?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about the mechanism. It's kind of complicated, but it could work. But the problem is I've never seen a Congress that could withstand it. So I don't know how
Maybe
in the
that's the
real
good
world.
thing. Maybe the little toddlers up in DC finally need to get locked down.
Yeah. Well, it would be great. I mean, anything that we could do to lock down the ability to simply print our way out of money is going to be beneficial to the public, because the worst thing that happens to the American public is that we no longer have control over the value of our own money. And
Right.
we know that Congress continues to spend money it doesn't have, and it has no downside from its point of view. I mean, it burns the public's wealth and inflates the value of money, but Congress itself doesn't, it's like they don't care. Most of the congressmen who are operating, they're operating in a world that we just don't understand and we don't relate to because it's not us. They don't have to face the same kind of problems that we do. But I would love to see that lockdown. That's why I was so interested in this Wyoming law. It's so interesting to me that we're taking a state and saying, well, let's start doing this. Let's at least have the state hold some physical gold and silver, and let's come up with a method to figure out how the public could actually use real gold and silver to pay expenses and bills. And, the more that we move towards that, the stronger as a nation we all will be. And I've always said, there was a cop I talked to, I don't remember, maybe 30 years ago, who told me, I would retire tomorrow as a police officer if crime disappeared. My job would no longer effectively be necessary. We would become maintenance people, and the reality of a policeman's work would evaporate if there were no more criminal activity.
Not like
And
they
I've
have.
always said that, if we didn't have to have a gold to silver standard, if we didn't have to have something to protect the value of money, I wouldn't be involved as much in the gold and silver world, except for my interest in rare coins, which has been around in my mind for 40 years. I love real cool old rare coins the way some guys love old motorcycles and some guys love old
Sure.
guitars and that kind of thing. But aside from that fascination and rarity and the cool artistic nature of rare coins, and by the way, we recently had a massive auction of coins, and some of the highest prices ever achieved for some of the rare coins hit the market. We now have new coins that have crossed into the $1 million, $2 million barrier, and it's phenomenal to watch that happen. There are now over 150, 170 coins that have crossed this $1 million bracket, and more than a dozen that are in the $10 million range and higher. And originally, they never thought there would be a coin that would ever break the $1 million barrier. But now, every year, when an auction is hosted of the highest value rare coins, new ones achieve this value. So this interest in high quality rarity is huge out there in the public. And that part of the market, wonderful. But the idea of having this to have it as wealth protection would completely go away if we had a gold standard. And half of what I do for a living wouldn't be necessary anymore because there would be more stability. But we don't live in that world. And I think things are going to get much more volatile going forward than most people are prepared for, because the rate of the volatility is picking up pace. The rate of printing money has picked up pace. If you could draw a chart out of how many dollars have been printed since 2020, it would blow your mind, because the chart would look like a parabolic chart. That
Right.
is, time passes and all you see is an increase in the number of dollars, and very little time is going by, but the dollar increases are massive. Things that used to take decades to happen are happening now within a year. So the loss in purchasing power of money is accelerating. And with this kind of economic environment where things are so uncertain, the most stable thing in the world has always been gold and silver. So I do believe that if the government will not provide us with that protection, if they're not going to have a gold standard and they're going to continue to use debt and use the dollar as a weapon around the world, let me tell you, people, you need to own physical gold and silver, and you need to start acquiring a stockpile of it as soon as you can. And I can't get over the numbers of people that we're seeing piling into this industry now. It's just incredible.
It's unreal. I have a philosophical question for you before we go more into the coins. I've often wondered this. So let's say, like, if I follow the big tech world, right?
Sure.
And let's say a software app is made, like Uber. When Uber first came out, it was just like, it was kind of crazy. People are like, "Oh, I'm not going to have somebody like drop something off of my house or food or whatever it is." To now, it's a mainstream standard app that everyone uses.
Totally
And
ubiquitous, right? The idea of just
totally.
getting in a stranger's car and having them drive you somewhere.
Right. So you have somebody who starts off with just in their garage making an app, and with some code, it turns into this. Let's call it 10 billion, but it's far bigger than that.
Sure.
$10 billion worth of value. Or you have your coins. You said that, now there's a $2 million value on a coin. Without that money being printed, how do we create value in a system like that, like a software or a coin? What software obviously is a little bit less tangible. Coin is very tangible in your hands. When we have, obviously there's an inflation aspect, which I understand that, but how do we it's almost like, I don't want to say printing money out of thin air, because it's not, because value is not the same as a fiat dollar. How do we create value and have the monetary system follow that? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure if I understand what you're asking.
So we create, like, for example, if someone says, "Oh, I think that software is worth $10 billion," even though
Okay.
that's not the actual like monetary valuation, it's the potential that it could make. Or the coin, for example. Now the coin is actual metal, right? But someone said, "You know what, that's worth $2 million." Where does that come from?
Okay. Well, in the case of the coin, it's a supply and demand issue.
Okay.
All right. So you have a coin from Civil War period, maybe only a handful of them were ever minted, or maybe only a handful of them exist. And you find the finest quality example of what remains in existence, and it comes up for sale. And what people look at is the opportunity to own something that no one can have. And I hate to say it, wealthy people love that kind of stuff.
Of
You
course.
know, people with
Art,
money have always
artifacts.
wanted to own the things that nobody else can have. And if you look at the way the values of things like that run in the world, it translates. I mean, look at the art world. You could take the most famous art pieces that sell for hundreds of millions of dollars and say to that same question, what defines that value? Why would somebody pay $100 million for $300 worth of canvas and paint, in a frame? Well, the rationale is that it was done by an artist who's dead. Obviously, he cannot create any more art. People have been interested in his art since whatever period of time. And the fact that no more of these ever can be produced creates a value. And the idea is that people look at these things and translate what the future value might be based upon that concept of supply and demand. If the supply end is locked down, obviously it is for any old coin, any coins that we work with, the most common ones, they stopped minting in 1964. But even that, think about that. That's 60 years ago. So if you can't make any more of something and the demand increases over time, the value price has to go up. That's the basic of
Right.
economics 101. It always will work that way. So the question is, will there be demand in the future? And when it comes to famous pieces of art, uh, rare motorcycles, rare cars, they always seem to have a tremendous demand from growing numbers of people who look at these physical items and want physical ownership themselves, but recognize that everybody can't have them. So there's the demand and supply characteristics. And this is the issue I have with the big issue I have with crypto is this possibility that the psychology of it could change. So, because that's all that's standing there. But when it comes to rare items, this has always been the case. I mean, it goes back to thousands of years how people have always wanted to acquire those items that nobody else can have and only the wealthy can afford. And, coins are interesting because there are a lot of very valuable coins that are, 15 or $20,000, not 2 or 3 million. So there's an array of them that are more affordable that do also make great ways for people to put away long-term capital. But that's the rationale. It's an interesting psychology, but it's well supported by thousands of years of economic history that supply and demand characteristics prevail. As long as there's interest in something that cannot be reduplicated, the chances are very good that the price of that item is going to continue to go up. And I think the record-setting prices have to do with um, the relative value of money. You have to really be fair about it, because what is $2 million today compared to what $2 million was in 1965?
Right.
They're
Right.
worlds apart. So clearly, to me, that coin value is going to continue to go up just based on the inflation of money. But it does provide an interesting counterbalance to what's happening to paper dollar, which, think about what a dollar is going to look like in 10 years. You don't have to go out 100 years. Just take a
No.
10-year time slot or a 5-year time slot and tell me how much more you're going to be using to buy the same goods and services, even those things that are not that rare. Look, we get interruptions, and we had a bird flu problem that created a problem with eggs. And the next thing you know, the price of eggs skyrockets. Now, this is not something where there will never be another egg. As long as there are chickens, there'll be more eggs.
Right.
So, but still, the supply and demand characteristics got squeezed a bit, where the flow of it, created a problem. And the next thing you know, prices go up. And that's just the nature of it. And this is why every time there's an interruption in these flows of things that are already kind of tight, like I've always looked at the silver market, for example, because the amount of usage that we have in silver, forgetting about coins for a minute, silver and gold, they're used in everything we do with electronics. They're
Right.
great conductors of electricity. They don't rust. They survive for thousands of years without a problem. They can be divided into multiple pieces, and each part is worth exactly one portion of what the whole was. And it can be reassembled back into a single piece without losing any value. And
Yep.
it's transportable. And again, it's sustainable. So it has wonderful properties. And as long as that usage continues, what we're finding is the amount of silver we can mine these days is barely, and I mean barely, able to meet the current demand. So if the demand kicks up a little bit, we're going to run into a big problem with the silver to where the prices will spike. So this is why I love when people take physical delivery of their gold and silver and they have it, because now you're locked. You got it. No matter what happens, you have ownership. There's no third party involved. You're not anticipating somebody that's holding your value for you. You have it in your possession. And I think every American needs to have at least a little physical wealth, whatever that might be, because again, I just don't have faith in the government solving the US dollar problem. And I would love to see us go back to a gold standard, but on a national scale, I think the likelihood of that is about as low as anything I can pick out on in terms of what's realistic.
Oh, totally. U.S. coin capital. Now you see right there how it's spelled. It's not like a capital letter capital. It's capital
the
as in
building.
like the Capitol building. So U.S. coin capital, CAPITOL. What can they look forward to working with Fred and Donna and others at U.S. Coin Capital?
Well, we have a great staff here, and people are willing to help people understand the basics, walk them through how this is done properly, and then provide physical gold and silver directly to our customers. We'll be more than happy to answer whatever questions people have to make sure they really understand both how they would benefit from this and how this whole thing works, so that they get the idea of understanding the value of what they're purchasing. And I think that's important. I mean, a lot of people do it, and this is okay, based just upon good faith with working with somebody they trust. But I like the idea of people having a grasp on this, because I want that education part of it to continue, not only to us, but the next generation, because we need to follow through and make sure that the next generation also gets it, so they don't find themselves in the same problem that their parents and grandparents have found themselves in now, where they counted on money in the form of paper and it didn't work for them. And I think this newer generation has a huge advantage in that the distribution of information is a lot more readily available than it
Oh,
used to be.
yes.
I hate to sound old, but when I grew up, I never thought I'd say that kind of stuff. We had to read books. We
Yeah.
had to read books. We had to go to the library. We had to take out that's how you learned. And nowadays, the information is, right at your fingertips, right? We have the body of all knowledge of human history in our hands, but that means that there's also a plethora of stuff out there that also makes it sometimes more difficult. Even though the information's available, it can be overwhelming because there's so much of it. And then some of it is, like in everything else, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So you sort of have to follow the trends. Oh, that's funny. You flashed by that. I may have to change those prices pretty quickly
Yeah.
on those packages. I didn't adjust to today's gold price because it moves so fast every day. I want to give it a couple of days, but yeah. So I just look at the price of gold when I first started, when it was running around $300 an ounce, and silver was $4, and it was hard to give away silver when it was $3.85 an ounce, and people are like, silver, okay. And 100-ounce bars that were $400 are now $3,300. So I just see what's happened in the history of the time I've been involved in it. But the thing that scares me is the acceleration of the nature of the problems. But yeah, we've got a great staff here, and anybody interested in learning about this, we've got a ton of information available on the website. And again, we will gladly speak with people to make sure they have a handle on how to understand this and how to do it properly.
Much appreciation as always, sir. Fantastic. And then I'm going to make sure that we get scheduled for within a couple weeks or so, because this is gonna go fast and furious. And today, and by the way, I'll ask this last question. Let's say they approve the spending bill in the next 24 hours, right?
You mean raise the debt limit?
Raise the debt limit, right?
Yeah, it's going to happen.
But aren't they going to have to do it? But aren't they going to have to do it again the next 3 months again?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this only buys
how
them a
else do
little
they
bit of
plan on
time.
doing this?
Until somebody has the guts to say, okay, enough is enough, and we're just going to rip the Band-Aid off and take the hit and start really shutting down government services that people are getting paid for from all these funds that government pays out. Other than that, it's just a perpetual game. We're going to keep playing it. And I don't like the idea that it's used as a political tool, as a political weapon. That just honestly pisses me off, because this is not something that Congress should be using. And again, I'm going to pick on the Democrats for a minute. I'm sorry if that aggravates half of the listening audience, but the idea of using this as leverage.
No, you don't worry. They're all conservative here for the most part.
Well, okay. Because the Democrats have effectively lost power. Like I said, you've got a Republican president, Republican Senate, Republican Congress, Republican. So House and Senate are all controlled now. So the Democrats have almost zero leverage. So anything they have that they can use to try to, insert what they want, if they're going to use those things for political purposes, that's what they're going to try to do. But to do this with the debt limit is aggravating to me, because it's not their money. You're screwing with the public here by doing that, and you're only doing it for political gain. You should recognize there are bigger issues than politics, and we have to accept the notion that you're going to have to suck it up if you don't like what's happening. I'm sorry, you're not in power. If you guys get elected, then you can choose how to deal with this stuff, but that's not the case. So the idea of using the debt as a political weapon just aggravates the crap out of me. But whether or not they raise the debt limit in time tomorrow, or we get a little bit of a government shutdown, and we'll see how long it lasts. It'll be a few days before the pressure starts building, and every day that it's shut down, the more the pressure builds. It's like a pressure cooker, and at some point you hit that critical mass where it's either all going to explode or something's going to give. And then, again, the tendency is Congress folds like a cheap suit. They give it up and they go ahead, raise the limit one more time, one more time, one more time. I'll have to count them up, because I've lost count since around the 1980s, how many times we've raised the debt ceiling since 1980. But I mean, it's insane. It's just ridiculous. But you got it right. They're just simply going to do it now. And then a few months from now, when they hit the debt ceiling again, they're going to do it again, because they don't have the guts to deal with the onslaught of what would happen if they don't.
So crazy. Fred, thank you as always for being on. We appreciate you, even with all the internet weird stuff today. And I think it's mostly Rumble and stuff like that. But
yeah, it's cool. I'm glad to
appreciate
be with
you, sir. I appreciate you.
Always happy to see you, man. Always good to see your smiling face. And
you as well. And I'm always thankful to have someone as intelligent as you are in this world, because I always say to people, there's the two main topics are health and wealth, right? And I have the health thing covered, and there's some good doctors out there, but there's not a lot. Like, the wealth thing can get really grimy at times, because obviously people can make a lot of money in the wealth area. So to get somebody who actually just knows what they're talking about, understands history and where real value is, that's important.
Yeah, I think it was Henry Ford who said, if the American public ever understood the way the monetary system actually worked, there would be revolution before morning.
Yes.
Henry Ford. I mean, so think about when that was, the turn of the
Right.
20th century, right? I mean, the early 1900s. And here we are 100 years later. It's like we've never learned the lesson. So for those listening, again, the best thing you can do, counterbalance your money and make sure that you own some physical gold and silver. And anybody who calls and mentions you and your shows, I always have some great deals available. So don't hesitate to give us a call.
Fred Dashevsky, US Coin Capital, uscoincapital.com. Everybody, appreciate you. We will see you for Prosperity Group tonight if you're in that membership. So check that out. And everybody have a great rest of your Thursday. For Fred, I'm Dr. Jason Dean. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.